What if I told you that some of the facts you were taught about British history weren't facts at all, but tidy little bedtime stories, stitched together to make conquest look like progress, cruelty look like character, and accident look like destiny? What if the villains were often more organized than the textbooks admit, and the heroes were sometimes just the people who got to write the plaque? Historical records show the past is messy. School lessons prefer it ironed. Tonight we're going to unpick 99 of the most common lies, some small, some enormous, all strangely persistent. If you like long, calm storytelling that lets your brain drift while your curiosity stays awake, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. The algorithm loves a ritual. Get comfortable. Let the names and dates wash over you. And as we move from myth to mechanism, remember, the point isn't to hate the past, it's to see it clearly, so the same tricks don't work twice. Lie 1. Magna Carta created democracy. The setup is a field in 1215, angry barons, a king forced to put his seal on a document, and the comforting idea that liberty was born fully formed in the long grass. The pivot is that Magna Carta wasn't written to make ordinary people free. It was written to make King John predictable, at least predictable enough that powerful landholders could protect their wealth, their rights, and their grip on the machinery of law. Yes, it contains principles that later generations would point to. Due process, limits on arbitrary rule, the famous line about lawful judgment, but in its original context, it's less human rights and more terms and conditions for a monarchy that had become financially desperate and politically reckless. Historical records show the charter was annulled almost immediately, reissued in revised forms and used as a bargaining chip for decades. Its afterlife is the revelation. Later lawyers and politicians treated it like scripture, quoting it as if the medieval authors had intended modern parliamentary democracy. It's not nothing. It's just not what the school poster promised. And speaking of posters, let's talk about the kind of turning point history loves to sell. Lie 2, 1066, changed everything overnight. The setup is dramatic. An arrow, a dead king, a new dynasty, and a neat before and after line. The pivot is that England didn't reboot like a machine. It staggered, argued, adapted, and endured, because most people can't afford a revolution. They still have to harvest the crops on Monday. The Normans did transform the ruling class. Land changed hands on a vast scale. Castles rose like blunt punctuation across the landscape, and the elite language shifted toward Norman French. Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, reads like the paperwork of conquest, measuring, listing, owning. But the revelation is continuity. Local customs didn't vanish. They were pressured, repackaged and negotiated. The parish rhythms continued. The old administrative shires kept functioning because conquering armies also need tax receipts. Even the English language didn't die. It absorbed, bent, and eventually swallowed its conqueror's vocabulary. What changed quickly was who sat on top and how ruthlessly they extracted value. What changed slowly was everything else. If you think that was tidy, wait until we get to the myths about civilizing Britain. Lie 3. The Romans turned Britain into a modern country. The setup is straight roads, baths, mosaics, and the soothing story that Rome arrived like a public works department. The pivot is that Rome arrived like an occupying power. The infrastructure was real. So were the taxes, the forced labor, the violence, and the constant need to keep certain people frightened enough to cooperate. Contemporary accounts and archaeology show Roman Britain was a patchwork. Some towns prospered. Many rural areas stayed rural. Romanization was uneven, often shallow, and frequently limited to those who benefited from playing along. Local elites who could gain status by copying Roman tastes. And the revelation is how quickly much of it faded when imperial support withdrew in the early 5th century. Coins stopped circulating, large-scale building declines, urban life contract. That doesn't mean everyone forgot civilization. It means the Roman system had been propped up by an empire's logistics, money, and soldiers. The lie isn't that Rome built things, the lie is that Rome built them for you. Meanwhile, the textbooks often give Britain a single identity far earlier than it actually existed. Lie 4. Boudicca fought for England. The setup is a furious queen, a chariot, and a national heroine, as if she burst into the world wearing the Union Jack. The pivot is that England didn't exist, not as a nation, not as a political project, not as an identity anyone could meaningfully claim in the 1st century. Boudicca led the Iceni, and her rebellion in AD 60 or 61 was part uprising, part revenge, part desperate gamble. Roman sources describe brutality on both sides, and archaeology supports the evidence of destruction in places like Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. The revelation is how later centuries repurposed her. Early modern writers and Victorian empire builders loved a native warrior queen because she could be turned into a symbol of British defiance, conveniently ignoring that she was defying an empire, and Britain later built one. This isn't about diminishing her, it's about refusing the costume department. History didn't happen to produce modern nationalism. Modern nationalism rummaged through history and picked what looked good on a pedestal. And speaking of pedestals, the Viking one is particularly weird. Lie 5. Vikings were just barbaric raiders. The setup is burning monasteries, horned helmets that never existed, and a simple morale, civilized Christians versus savage pagans. The pivot is that Vikings were raiders, yes, but they were also traders, settlers, lawmakers, shipwrights, and political operators who understood profit as well as terror. Historical records and material evidence show Viking activity range from violent coastal strikes to long-term settlement in places like the Danelaw. They founded towns, shaped trade routes, and married into local societies. They weren't an alien species, they were humans responding to incentives: silver, land, status, opportunity. The revelation is that medieval Europe did plenty of raiding without calling itself Viking. Slaving raids, feuds, punitive expeditions, violence was a common language. The Norse just arrived with excellent boats and a willingness to exploit soft targets. The lie survives because it feels flattering. It makes us civilized and them monstrous. But history rarely hands out moral uniforms that clean. Remember that pattern. We'll see it again and again. Lie 6. The Anglo-Saxons were one people with one culture. The setup is a single migration story. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes arrive, and suddenly there is Anglo-Saxon England, as if stamped out in identical units. The pivot is that the early medieval period was a kaleidoscope of kingdoms, dialects, alliances, and identities that shifted with politics and marriage as much as with ancestry. Archaeology, place names, and texts suggest movement, yes, but also continuity. Many Britons didn't vanish. They adapted, intermarried, and survived under new rulers. Power changed hands more often than bloodlines disappeared. The revelation is that Anglo-Saxon is partly a scholarly convenience. It can be useful, but it becomes a lie when treated as a pure ethnic bloc. Later centuries turned it into a myth of origin, sometimes with ugly political intent, pretending the island was meant for one kind of people. History doesn't do destiny, people do propaganda. And speaking of propaganda, few figures have been polished as aggressively as the next one. Lie 7. Alfred the Great founded England. The setup is a heroic king, cakes in a peasant's oven, and a tidy origin story where one man invents a nation. The pivot is that Alfred of Wessex did remarkable things, defended his kingdom against Viking armies, reorganized defenses, supported learning and translation, but he didn't found England like a business launching a brand. England emerged through centuries of warfare, diplomacy, and absorption. Wessex expanding, Mercia declining, Scandinavian settlements integrating, and later rulers consolidating power. Alfred's children and grandchildren, especially Edward the Elder and Ethelstan, pushed the political project much further. The revelation is that the Great label is itself part of the story. Later writers emphasized Alfred because he fit a comforting model: the wise founder, the bookish warrior, the almost modern patriot. He's a useful ancestor, and that usefulness can distort. This is documented in how chronicles are compiled and how later centuries retell earlier events with their own needs in mind. Alfred deserves respect. He doesn't deserve to be turned into a national shortcut. Meanwhile, entire centuries get shoved into one grim stereotype. Lie 8. The Middle Ages were 1,000 years of filth and ignorance. The setup is mud, plague, and everyone believing the earth is flat while eating with their hands in a permanent fog. The pivot is that medieval life was often harsh, but it was also inventive, organized and intellectually alive, just not always in ways that fit modern bragging rights. Cathedrals didn't build themselves, neither did legal systems, guild structures, universities, or the administrative habits that later governments inherited. Medieval people measured time, tracked debts, argued in court, read texts, and developed technologies in agriculture and engineering that changed productivity. The revelation is that the Dark Ages is a later insult, often used by Renaissance thinkers and Enlightenment writers to make themselves look brighter by contrast. It's less a description of medieval reality and more a marketing campaign for the future. Yes, there was poverty and disease, but there was also art, music, debate, and a constant negotiation between local custom and elite power. And speaking of disease, even the Black Death gets simplified into a single cartoon villain. Lie 9. The Black Death was just rats and fleas. The setup is a neat biology lesson. Rats carry fleas, fleas carry plague, and the story ends. The pivot is that pandemics rarely obey one clean route, and medieval plague outbreaks likely involved multiple transmission pathways, different local conditions, and recurring waves that reshaped society for generations. Historical records show the Black Death arrived in the late 1340s and killed with terrifying speed. Contemporary accounts describe swollen buboes, fever, delirium, and death within days. But the revelation is that plague in the records can include a mix of symptoms and possibilities, and even when Yersinia pestis is central, the way it spread could vary. Human fleas, lice, pneumonic transmission, crowded housing, trade networks. What matters for our story is the consequence. Labour shortages increased bargaining power for surviving workers. Wages rose in places, authorities panicked, and attempts to freeze wages through law sparked resentment. It wasn't just a medical event, it was a social earthquake. And speaking of panicked authorities, they have a long habit of calling protest criminal when it's actually political. Lie 10, the peasants' revolt was a pointless riot that failed. The setup is 1381, angry crowds and the comforting idea that ordinary people flailed and then disappeared back into the mud. The pivot is that the revolt was organized, widespread, and frighteningly articulate. It targeted records, officials, and symbols of lordship because the rebels understood exactly how they were being controlled. Contemporary chronicles describe figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball. The rebels marched on London, demanded an end to serfdom and oppressive taxation, and forced the teenage King Richard II into negotiations. Yes, the revolt was crushed. Leaders were killed. Promises were broken. That's the familiar ending. The revelation is the long echo. Authorities learned fear. The ruling class realized peasants could coordinate. Serfdom's decline continued over the following centuries, driven by economics and bargaining as well as by rebellion. Even a failed uprising can change the range of what rulers think they can safely do. If you think that was the last time a king lied to a crowd, history has bad news. Lie 11. Richard III definitely killed the princes in the Tower. The setup is irresistible. Two vanished boys, a wicked uncle, and Shakespeare sharpening his knife for the stage. The pivot is that we do not have a signed confession, a witnessed murder account, or a body with a neat label saying case closed. Richard III had motive and opportunity, and many historians consider him the most likely culprit. But the revelation is that the story is also political currency. The Tudors benefited enormously from painting Richard as a monster to justify their own shaky claim after 1485. Later narratives, including Shakespeare's, amplified that image into cultural cement. What we do have are hostile sources, suspicious timing, and the blunt fact of disappearance. We also have later confessions of dubious reliability and centuries of rumour. The truth may be simple, it may be messy, but certainty is the lie that gets taught because it fits the exam. History often hands us probabilities, not courtroom verdicts. And speaking of Tudor storytelling, the next lie is practically a national hobby. Lie 12, Henry VIII created the Church of England just to get a divorce. The setup is Henry wants Anne Boleyn, the Pope says no, and England becomes Protestant in a fit of romantic impatience. The pivot is that Henry's marital crisis mattered, but it collided with long-running tensions, royal power versus papal authority, money flowing to Rome, reformist ideas spreading, and a state hungry for control of church wealth. The break with Rome in the 1530s wasn't a single door slam. It was a sequence of laws, oaths, and administrative transformations. Monasteries were dissolved, their land seized and redistributed, an enormous transfer of wealth that bound new elites to the Tudor regime. The revelation is that Henry himself was not a tidy Protestant hero. He kept many Catholic beliefs and punished reformers when it suited him. What changed fastest was governance. The crown gained unprecedented authority over religion as a tool of state. This is documented in official statutes, financial records, and the sudden appearance of very interested buyers for former church property. The divorce story is catchy. The land story is the real engine. And speaking of engines, the next lie is about a queen whose image was engineered with astonishing skill. Lie 13. Elizabeth, I ruled by pure popular love. The setup is Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, adored by all, steering England with serene brilliance. The pivot is that Elizabeth's reign was also anxious, surveilled, and frequently brutal, because a female monarch in a contested religious landscape had to project control like a weapon. Yes, there was cultural flowering. Yes, she was politically sharp. But the revelation is the machinery beneath the portraits: censorship, informants, persecution of Catholics and radicals, and harsh penalties for those seen as threats. The state's fear wasn't imaginary. There were plots, foreign tensions, and genuine security risks. But the story taught in school often turns this into a simple romance between monarch and people. In reality, popularity was managed. Royal progresses displayed power. Carefully crafted images, white face paint, symbolic dresses, staged iconography, created a myth of timeless stability. Historical records show rebellions and unrest still existed. Poverty did not evaporate, and the crown's finances were often strained. Elizabeth didn't float above politics. She survived it by controlling the narrative better than almost anyone. Meanwhile, controlling the narrative is exactly why a certain November story gets told the way it does. Lie 14. The gunpowder. Plot was just a Catholic tantrum. The setup is fireworks morality. Catholics are villains. Parliament is innocent and the state heroically saves itself. The pivot is that the gunpowder plot of 1605 grew from a specific climate: harsh anti-Catholic laws, fear of foreign intervention, and a Protestant state that treated Catholic practice as potential treason. Guy Fawkes wasn't even the mastermind. He was the explosives man, the face that fit the poster. The revelation is how the aftermath was used. The government turned the plot into a yearly ritual of loyalty, reinforcing Protestant identity and legitimizing repression. Remember, remember is catchy for a reason. It's propaganda that sings. There are genuine questions historians still argue about: how much the authorities knew, whether informants shaped the plot's exposure, and how the state benefited from the fear it amplified. What's certain is that the plot's failure became a political asset. The story is taught as a clean battle between good government and evil conspirators. The reality is a state learning how to weaponize panic. And speaking of panic, the next century is often taught as if it were just a costume drama. Lie 15. The English Civil War was just Cavaliers versus Roundheads. The setup is charming. Fancy hats against plain haircuts, king versus parliament, a neat duel of principles. The pivot is that the civil wars of the 1640s were multiple conflicts tangled together across England, Scotland and Ireland, with religion, local grievances and competing visions of sovereignty all colliding. Some people fought for Parliament because they feared absolutism. Some fought for the king because they feared radicalism or sectarian rule. Many fought because their region, patron or church demanded it. And in Ireland, the violence and dispossession were catastrophic, woven into a longer story of colonisation and rebellion. The revelation is that Parliament wasn't a single voice. It fractured. It argued. It produced radicals who wanted far more change than cautious elites could tolerate. Armies became political actors. Ordinary soldiers debated rights and representation in ways that still feel startling. This is documented in pamphlets, sermons, petitions, and the anxious tone of those trying to control events that refused to stay controlled. The hat imagery is fun. It just hides the blood and the complexity. And speaking of fun, one particular holiday gets dragged into this story, with a myth attached like a price tag. Lie 16. Cromwell banned Christmas because he hated joy. The setup is a dour Puritan marching into your living room and confiscating your pudding. The pivot is that the suppression of Christmas in the 1640s and 1650s wasn't one man's personal grudge against cheer. It was part of a wider Puritan critique. They saw Christmas celebrations as disorderly, drunken, and too closely tied to Catholic tradition. Parliament issued ordinances and local enforcement varied wildly. In some places, people ignored the rules. In others, authorities cracked down. The revelation is that what was really being policed wasn't happiness, it was social control. Festivals are moments when ordinary people gather, drink, mock authority, and sometimes riot. Regimes notice. Cromwell didn't need to personally hate mince pies. The state simply preferred predictable behaviour, especially after years of war. And the myth survives because it's emotionally satisfying. It turns a complex religious and political struggle into a sitcom villain. Also, it allows later England to pretend it got Christmas back, as if culture is a stolen object rather than a constantly evolving negotiation. And speaking of negotiations, the so-called bloodless revolution is anything but, depending on where you were standing. Lie 17. The glorious revolution was bloodless. The setup is 1688. James II flees, William of Orange arrives, Parliament smiles, and England gently upgrades its constitution. The pivot is that bloodless describes, at best, a narrow slice of events in England among certain elites. In Ireland and Scotland, the consequences were violent. The Williamite War in Ireland brought sieges, battles, and atrocities, and its legacy shaped politics and identity for centuries. Scotland experienced upheaval and repression too, and the settlement of the revolution locked in religious and political divides. The revelation is that calling it bloodless is a way of flattering the English political tradition, suggesting stability, reason, and polite legalism. But stability for some was disaster for others. Even in England, the revolution involved anxiety, coercion, and a very real threat of force. Official records show sweeping changes: the Bill of Rights, constraints on royal power, and a new relationship between Crown and Parliament. Those matters. But the myth is that it all happened without suffering. History loves clean adjectives. Reality resists them. And speaking of clean stories, the next lie pretends Britain's political modernity appeared by magic. Lie 18. Britain became a constitutional monarchy, smoothly and fairly. The setup is a triumphant arc. Medieval tyranny becomes modern liberty, and everyone politely agrees. The pivot is that constitutional change in Britain was often reactive, elite-driven, and designed to keep power in familiar hands while claiming the language of the people. Parliament gained authority, yes, but for a long time Parliament was not a democratic body. It was riddled with patronage, rotten boroughs, and property restrictions that excluded most men and all women. The law could limit kings while still crushing workers, dissenters, and colonized subjects. The revelation is that constitutional monarchy can sound like a moral achievement when it's also a power bargain. The crown yields to Parliament, and Parliament remains dominated by landowners and wealthy interests. Reform came in waves, often after pressure, protest, and fear of unrest. Historical records show repeated attempts to silence radical movements and manage the franchise like a valve. Open it just enough to prevent explosion, then claim the whole system is naturally fair. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't inevitable. It was contested, because power never retires voluntarily. And speaking of power, the next lie is about the countryside, where power was quietly rearranged with paperwork and fences. Lie 19. Enclosure was just efficient modern farming. The setup is improvement, open fields replaced by neat hedges, productivity rising, progress marching forward. The pivot is that enclosure was also dispossession, taking commons that poor people relied on and converting them into private property guarded by law. In many places, people had customary rights, grazing animals, gathering wood, gleaning leftover crops, using common land as a survival buffer. Enclosure reorganized that landscape. Sometimes it was negotiated. Often it was imposed through Parliament, mapped and surveyed by those who benefited most. The revelation is that improvement had a human cost: loss of independence, forced migration to towns, and the creation of a landless labor force. The new rural order wasn't just agricultural, it was social engineering. This is documented in enclosure acts, maps, court cases, and the repeated appearance of hunger and unrest in regions undergoing rapid change. The countryside didn't simply modernize, it was re-owned. And speaking of the towns people were pushed into, the next lie claims industrialization was basically a public health initiative. Lie 20. The Industrial Revolution quickly made life better for most people. The setup is steam engines and rising wealth, a national success story where suffering is a brief montage before prosperity arrives. The pivot is that early industrial Britain was often brutal. Long hours, dangerous machines, polluted air, overcrowded housing, contaminated water, and epidemics that tore through cities built faster than sanitation. Yes, productivity soared. Yes, Britain grew rich, but the revelation is distribution. The gains were uneven and often delayed for ordinary workers. Real wage improvements depended on period and place, and many families experienced the benefits as a demand to work more for survival. Historical records show child labor, workplace injuries, and the slow, contested development of regulations. The factory wasn't just a site of innovation, it was a site of discipline. Timekeeping, fines, surveillance, and the conversion of human energy into profit. The myth survives because Britain later became wealthier and because winners wrote the celebratory version. But if you lived in an early industrial slum, progress smelled like sewage and coal smoke. And speaking of sewage, the next lie is that Victorian poverty was softened by benevolent institutions. Lie 21. Workhouses were charity with a strict but kind hand. The setup is moral assistance, a grim building, but ultimately a safety net for the unfortunate. The pivot is that the workhouse system, especially after the 1834 Poor Law reforms in England and Wales, was often designed to deter. Hard conditions were not an accident. They were part of policy. Families could be separated. Food could be meager, work could be monotonous, exhausting, and humiliating. The idea was simple: make relief unpleasant so that only the truly desperate would apply, and so that low wages outside would look preferable by comparison. The revelation is how openly this logic was discussed. Parliamentary debates and official reports reveal a fear of dependency that outweighed compassion. The poor were treated as a problem to manage, not people to support. Yes, there were variations between unions and individual guardians. Some places were less harsh, but the underlying mechanism remained. Poverty was moralized, and help was weaponized. At least the myth admits workhouses were grim. The next lie tries to pretend the children inside weren't doing very much. Lie 22. Child labor was rare, short-lived, and not that bad. The setup is a few sad images in a textbook and the reassurance that reforms quickly fixed it. The pivot is that child labor was deeply woven into Britain's industrial economy. Children worked in textile mills, mines, farms, domestic service, street trades, often because family survival depended on every wage, however small. Contemporary investigations and testimony describe long shifts, fatigue, beatings and injuries. In mines, children hauled coal in darkness. In mills, they tended machines that could tear skin and fingers. The hours could be punishing, and schooling, when available, often came second. The revelation is that reform was slow and contested. Factory Acts limited hours and improved conditions in stages, but enforcement was inconsistent, and employers fought restrictions. Even when laws changed, poverty kept pushing children into work, sometimes outside regulated industries. This is documented in parliamentary inquiries, inspectors' reports, and the grim arithmetic of household budgets. It's not that Victorians didn't know. It's that many powerful Victorians decided children's suffering was an acceptable cost. And speaking of cost, the next lie is that Britain's wealth arrived through brave explorers, not corporate machinery. Lie 23. The empire was built by adventure, not by companies and accounting. The setup is romantic. Ships on the horizon, daring men with maps, distant lands discovered. The pivot is that much of the empire expanded through chartered companies, financial instruments, and bureaucratic control, profit-seeking organizations with quasi-state power. The East India Company is the most famous example, but it's part of a wider pattern. Trade monopolies, private armies, treaties signed under pressure, and taxation systems designed to extract wealth. The empire didn't just plant flags, it wrote contracts, set tariffs, controlled ports, and manipulated local politics. The revelation is that the line between state and business was often blurred on purpose. When ventures succeeded, the rewards were private. When they produced chaos, the state frequently stepped in, sometimes to restore order, sometimes to protect investments. Historical records show meticulous attention to revenue, commodities, and shipping. The romance is the perfume sprayed over a ledger book. And speaking of ledger books, one of the most persistent lies is that Britain ended slavery mainly because it had a sudden moral awakening. Lie 24. Britain abolished slavery, purely out of moral goodness. The setup is heroic abolitionists, righteous speeches, and a nation congratulating itself for being on the right side of history. The pivot is that abolition was real and hard-won, but it was also tangled with economics, rebellion, geopolitics, and the constant pressure of enslaved people resisting their own bondage. Abolitionists campaigned for decades. Religious movements, petitions, and organizing mattered. But the revelation is that enslaved uprisings and the costs of maintaining plantation slavery reshaped calculation. In 1833, when slavery was abolished in most of the British Empire, the state compensated enslavers, not the enslaved, through a massive payout that helped preserve elite wealth. Official records show apprenticeship systems that extended coerced labor, and British involvement didn't simply vanish. Forms of exploitation continued, and Britain's global economy remained connected to coerced labor elsewhere. So yes, abolition was a moral struggle. It was also a political bargain, and the victors ensured they were repaid. Meanwhile, Britain's wars are often taught with the same flattering filter, especially the ones against Napoleon. Lie 25. Britain fought Napoleon only for freedom and principle. The setup is a noble island standing against tyranny, defending liberty across Europe. The pivot is that Britain did oppose Napoleon's imperial aggression, but it also pursued its own interests with fierce consistency. Naval dominance, trade protection, colonial advantage, and the containment of any power that threatened its position. The wars from 1793 to 1815 were vast and expensive. The British state borrowed heavily, taxed widely and relied on a global system of finance and supply. Ordinary people faced food prices, press gangs, and crackdowns on dissent, as authorities feared revolution at home as much as invasion from abroad. The revelation is that freedom was selective. Britain could champion constitutionalism in Europe, while suppressing radical politics domestically and expanding imperial control overseas. Principles and profit were not enemies, they were often partners. Historical records show propaganda, patriotic ritual, and the careful crafting of national identity around war. The story is inspirational. The reality is strategic. And speaking of strategy, the next lie turns a disaster into a misunderstanding by pretending a famine was just bad weather. Lie 26. The Irish famine was a natural disaster, not a political choice. The setup is a blight on potatoes in the 1840s, an unavoidable tragedy, and a shrugging phrase. What could anyone do? The pivot is that while the potato disease was biological, the scale of death and suffering was political. Ireland was not empty. It was not isolated. It was not beyond help. It was a governed land inside a wider imperial economy, and policy choices shaped who lived and who did not. Historical records show the potato crop failed repeatedly from 1845 onward. Contemporary accounts describe hunger, disease, eviction, and desperate migration. But the revelation is that food continued to be produced and exported from Ireland during the famine years. The mechanisms of land ownership, rent, and trade kept operating while people starved. Relief efforts existed, but they were often constrained by ideology, fear of creating dependency, faith in markets, and a willingness to treat mass suffering as an unfortunate lesson in economics. If something is uncertain, say so plainly. Scholars debate exact figures and the balance between intention and negligence. But the best supported view is clear. Policy intensified catastrophe. The famine was not simply weather, it was power. And speaking of power, Britain's story of benevolent rule in Ireland relies on forgetting what rule looked like on the ground. Lie 27. The union with Ireland was a fair marriage of equal partners. The setup is constitutional tidiness. The Act of Union in 1801. One kingdom becomes part of another, and everyone gains stability. The pivot is that the union was not a symmetrical handshake. It followed decades of conflict, fear of rebellion, and a political elite in London determined to secure control. Contemporary debates and later investigations point to the use of patronage, pressure, and what critics described as outright corruption to push the union through the Irish Parliament. The revelation is that representation at Westminster did not mean Irish interests were suddenly safe. It meant Irish politics were absorbed into a system where power was concentrated elsewhere, and where land, religion, and class shaped whose voices mattered. The Union also became a mechanism for managing Irish demands without granting Irish autonomy. That tension did not fade, it sharpened. And the equal partners story persists because it makes empire sound like administration, not domination. But if you think that's uncomfortable, wait until we talk about Britain's domestic order and what it cost the people who couldn't afford protection. Lie 28. The police were created to protect everyone equally. The setup is a comforting one. Modern policing begins in 1829 with the Metropolitan Police, designed to keep citizens safe. The pivot is that policing also developed as a tool to manage the poor, control disorder, and protect property in a rapidly urbanizing society. Early policing was controversial. Many feared it would resemble a standing army, uniformed force turned inward. The revelation is that the police did, in practice, concentrate attention on the behaviors of working people. Public drunkenness, street trading, vagrancy, disorderly gatherings, and strikes. Protecting the public often meant protecting the public order as defined by elite. Historical records show policing was bound up with morality campaigns and class assumptions. The same act, loitering, shouting, gathering, could be read as community in one context and threat in another, depending on who was doing it and where. Policing can reduce violence, it can also reproduce hierarchy. The lie is pretending it was ever purely neutral. And speaking of neutrality, the next lie claims Britain's legal system was a calm temple of justice, rather than an instrument with a very sharp edge. Lie 29. The law was harsh, but it was fair. The setup is black robes, solemn judges, and the fiction that the law treats everyone the same because the words are the same on the page. The pivot is that enforcement, discretion, and access to defense have always shaped outcomes. A law that looks equal can still land hardest on the people with the least money, the least influence, and the least ability to disappear. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, the so-called Bloody Code listed a staggering number of capital offences, many involving property. Over time, executions declined and reforms came, but the revelation is that the threat of punishment functioned as social control even when it was not applied uniformly. Historical records show pardons were common, and that's part of the problem. Mercy wasn't evenly distributed. It could be bought with connections, reputation, and respectability. Meanwhile, transportation, imprisonment, and public shaming reshaped lives in ways that rarely appear in heroic national narratives. The lie is not that law existed. The lie is that it floated above class. And speaking of punishment systems, Britain exported one of its most famous solutions across oceans. Lie 30. Transportation to Australia was a humane alternative. The setup is almost merciful. Instead of execution, criminals are sent to a new life in a faraway land. The pivot is that transportation was a brutal, coerced labour system, wrapped in the language of second chances. Convicts endured long voyages in cramped conditions, disease and despair. On arrival, many were assigned to harsh labour regimes under military discipline. The revelation is that transportation also helped Britain colonise territory, seize land from indigenous peoples, and build infrastructure with forced labour. It was punishment and expansion in one package. If you think of it as they got a fresh start, you miss the reality that for many it was exile, control, and exploitation, often for relatively minor crimes shaped by poverty. And for indigenous communities, it was the arrival of a settler project that would bring violence, dispossession, and cultural destruction. Official records indicate extensive regulation of convict labour and constant anxiety about control, because a system like this requires force, not optimism. Meanwhile, when Britain wasn't sending people away, it was sending them down, into mines, mills, and the kind of progress that chewed bodies. Lie 31. The working class accepted their place until they were given rights. The setup is a patient population waiting politely for reformers to notice them. The pivot is that working people organised constantly. Unions, mutual aid societies, petitions, strikes, demonstrations, and sometimes sabotage. Rights were not gifts. They were fought for, negotiated for, and extracted under pressure. The Chartists in the 1830s and 1840s demanded political representation, votes, fair constituencies, secret ballots. They mobilized huge crowds and gathered mass petitions. The revelation is that elites responded with fear, arrest, surveillance, military presence, and the framing of political demands as threats to order. Even when Chartism failed in its immediate goals, its ideas didn't vanish. They became part of the political atmosphere. Later reforms echoed earlier demands, because once a demand is spoken by millions, it tends to linger. The lie is the bedtime version of democracy. Kind men in Parliament gradually improving society out of goodwill. The reality is conflict. And speaking of conflict, the next lie claims the British state was a gentle guardian, not a nervous machine that occasionally panicked and crushed people. Lie 32. Britain did not have a tradition of state violence at home. The setup is that real repression happens elsewhere, on the continent, in dictatorships, not in respectable Britain. The pivot is that Britain used troops against crowds, broke strikes, and responded to unrest with force often enough that it became a recurring fear in working-class politics. There were incidents where soldiers fired on civilians, authorities used harsh laws to suppress organising, and courts imposed punishing sentences to deter dissent. The revelation is that the state could be both stable and violent. Those aren't opposites. Stability can be enforced. Historical accounts describe moments when protests turned deadly, and parliamentary debates show constant worry about disorder. The fear was not only of violence but of ideas, mass politics, radicalism, the suggestion that the poor might govern themselves. The lie survives because Britain's long-term political continuity makes it easy to forget the cracks. But continuity often depends on how hard you press when people push back. And speaking of pressing, the next lie is about Victorian morality and who it was actually designed to discipline. Lie 33. Victorian morality was mainly about values, not control. The setup is prudishness, covered ankles, stern sermons, and the notion of a society obsessed with virtue for virtue's sake. The pivot is that morality often functioned as a technology of class control, policing sexuality, poverty, and behavior in the people least able to resist. Campaigns against vice targeted working-class neighborhoods. Institutions and charities enforced standards of respectability as conditions for help. The revelation is that moral language justified surveillance. If poverty is framed as a personal failure, then structural reform becomes optional. If women's sexuality is framed as dangerous, then controlling women becomes protection. Historical records show a world where double standards were common. Elite men could behave privately in ways they condemned publicly, while working-class women could be destroyed by rumor. This isn't about saying everyone was a hypocrite. It's about seeing how moral narratives distribute shame and authority. And speaking of shame, the next lie is that British history is a steady march toward fairness, especially for women. Lie 34. Women had no power until the vote, so their history starts there. The setup is a blank page until suffragettes appear, as if women were passive spectators for centuries. The pivot is that women shaped economic life, family strategies, community networks, and political pressure long before formal voting rights. Women ran businesses, managed estates, worked in trades, organized boycotts, wrote pamphlets, and influenced religious movements. Some had legal constraints, some found loopholes. The revelation is that the absence of a vote did not equal the absence of agency. It meant agency operated through different channels, often informal, often precarious, sometimes brutally punished. And when women demanded formal political rights, the struggle was not a polite debate. It involved imprisonment, force-feeding, public hostility, and deep divisions about tactics. Historical records show the franchise expanded in stages and unevenly, and that women's political participation was constrained by class and race as well as sex. The lie is the idea of a simple, before powerless, after empowered switch. And speaking of switches, the next lie is that Britain's global dominance was basically inevitable, like a natural law. Lie 35. Britain became a world power because it was better at everything. The setup is national self-confidence, superior ships, superior institutions, superior character. The pivot is that Britain's rise depended on a mix of geography, finance, violence, opportunism, and sometimes sheer luck, along with the exploitation of labour and resources far beyond the island. Naval power mattered, but it required money. Money required taxation and credit. Credit required trust. And trust was built through institutions that served investors and elites. The revelation is that better often meant more willing to weaponize systems. Britain used maritime dominance to shape trade, enforce blockades and squeeze rivals. And empire wasn't a passive result of excellence. It was actively constructed through wars, treaties, and sometimes deliberate destabilization. This is documented in diplomatic correspondence, commercial records, and the constant attention to securing routes, ports, and commodities. The lie comforts the national ego. The reality is mechanics. And speaking of mechanics, one of the most mechanically misunderstood events in British history is the so-called scramble that is often taught like an adventure map. Lie 36. Colonization was mostly peaceful. Settlement and trade. The setup is traders meeting locals, exchanging goods, and gradually building modern states. The pivot is that colonization frequently involved coercion, land seizure, legal redefinition of ownership, forced labor systems, and violent, both open and bureaucratic. Even when initial contact was trade, the power imbalance was often decisive. The revelation is how quickly commerce could become control. Once a company or state decided it wanted monopoly, territory, or strategic advantage, treaties could be signed under duress. Legal systems could declare land unused if it didn't match European agricultural patterns. Indigenous resistance could be framed as criminality rather than defense. Historical records show repeated cycles: intrusion, conflict, repression, extraction, and then official narratives about bringing order. The lie is the sanitized version that treats conquest as paperwork. And speaking of paperwork, the next lie is that Britain's empire was run on gentlemanly principles rather than on explicit racial hierarchy. Lie 37. The empire was colorblind in intent, only flawed in execution. The setup is a polite myth. Britain believed in law and fair play, so racism must have been an accidental byproduct. The pivot is that racial thinking was embedded in imperial governance, justified in popular culture, and used to rationalize unequal rights, unequal wages, unequal justice, and unequal lives. The revelation is that racial hierarchy was not only prejudice, it was policy. It shaped who could own land, who could serve in certain roles, who could travel freely, who could be believed in court, and it shaped how violence was explained. Repression framed as pacification, resistance framed as savagery. This is documented in official attitudes, colonial regulations, and the language of administrators who described subject populations as childlike, dangerous, or in need of discipline. Not every individual believed the same things, but the structure had a logic. The lie survives because admitting structure is heavier than blaming a few bad apples. And speaking of heavy truths, the next lie is that Britain brought railways, law, and education to India as a gift. Lie 38. Britain developed India primarily for Indians' benefit. The setup is infrastructure as benevolence: railways, telegraphs, civil service exams. The pivot is that infrastructure in colonial settings often served extraction and control. Railways helped move troops and commodities. Telegraphs helped manage rebellion. Administrative systems helped collect revenue efficiently. There were Indians who used these systems for their own advancement and who strategically engaged with the opportunities created. But the revelation is that development was not neutral. It shaped economies to serve imperial markets, encouraging certain cash crops, reorganizing land revenue, and tying local industries to British needs. If something is disputed, say so plainly. Historians argue about the net economic impact over the long term, but many agree that colonial policy often hindered local industrial growth while channeling wealth outward. Contemporary critiques existed at the time, not just in hindsight. The lie is the gift narrative. The reality is the invoice. And speaking of invoices, the next lie insists Britain's role in the Atlantic slave economy can be cleanly separated into "we ended it, so we're the good guys." Lie 39. Britain's anti-slavery patrol eraser tooled its past. The setup is heroic naval patrols intercepting slave ships, a righteous empire policing the seas. The pivot is that this later role does not erase earlier centrality. Britain's ports, financiers, insurers, and merchants were deeply entwined with the slave economy for generations. Yes, the Royal Navy did conduct anti-slavery patrols in the 19th century, and that effort had real impact. The revelation is that the story can become a moral alibi, used to avoid talking about compensation to enslavers, the wealth built from earlier trafficking, and the continued exploitation that replaced formal slavery in many places. Historical records show abolition was not the end of coerced labor. Indentured systems, plantation economies, and brutal colonial labor practices persisted. Britain could fight one form of slavery, while benefiting from others. The lie is the clean redemption arc. The past is not that generous. Meanwhile, at home, a different redemption story gets told about war, especially one war that Britain loves to call its finest hour, as if the hour didn't cast shadows. Lie 40. Britain entered World War I with unity and clarity. The setup is August 1914, crowds cheering, young men eager, a nation sure of its cause. The pivot is that the outbreak of war was accompanied by confusion, debate, fear and coercion, as well as patriotism. Many enlisted from pressure, economic necessity, or local expectation. Not everyone cheered. The revelation is how quickly the state expanded its powers: censorship, surveillance, propaganda, and later conscription. Dissent existed: conscientious objectors, pacifists, labor activists, and the response could be harsh. Women's work expanded dramatically, but that didn't automatically translate into equality afterward. And the war itself was a slaughter of industrial scale, with class shaping who served where and who died. Officers often came from different social backgrounds than enlisted men, and while that wasn't absolute, it mattered in culture and treatment. The lie is the postcard version. The reality is a society strained, reorganized, and often traumatized, then told to move on quietly. And speaking of moving on quietly, the next lie is that World War I solved the class system by mixing men in trenches. Lie 41. The trenches made Britain classless. The setup is comradeship. Everyone suffers together, so everyone becomes equal. The pivot is that shared suffering doesn't automatically dissolve hierarchy. It can bond people, yes, but the army still reflected class structures in recruitment, promotion, and authority. Many junior officers came from privileged backgrounds, educated in systems designed to produce leaders. Working-class men could become officers too, especially as casualties mounted. But the revelation is that the cultural assumptions remained. Accent, schooling, and social confidence shaped perception. Back home, class didn't evaporate, it mutated. The war produced new expectations about wages, housing, and respect, but elites still fought to preserve status. Post-war unrest, strikes, and political change show a society arguing about what sacrifices should buy. The lie is that misery is a shortcut to justice. And speaking of justice, one of the most persistent myths is that Britain stood alone in World War II like a lone lighthouse against the storm. Lie 42. Britain stood alone in World War II without empire or allies. The setup is heroic solitude. 1940. The Blitz, a small island defiant. The pivot is that Britain's war effort relied on empire, resources, and global connections. Troops from across the Commonwealth and colonies fought. Raw materials flowed. Strategic depth mattered. The revelation is that Britain in wartime propaganda often meant an imperial network, yet those who contributed were not always treated as equal partners afterward. Colonial subjects could be asked to fight for freedom abroad while lacking it at home, and even in 1940, standing alone is a rhetorical flourish. Britain was not allied to the Axis, yes, and it faced terrifying danger, yes, but it also had support, intelligence networks, supplies, and eventually the vast weight of the United States and the Soviet Union as crucial parts of the Allied victory. The lie is not that Britain endured. The lie is the solo myth that erases the many hands holding up the story. And speaking of erasure, the next lie is that the British Empire ended neatly because Britain generously decided it was time. Lie 43. Decolonization was a gift, not a struggle. The setup is graceful retreat. Britain recognizes the moral tide and peacefully grants independence. The pivot is that independence movements fought, organized, negotiated, and suffered. Britain sometimes negotiated. Britain sometimes repressed. Often it did both at once. Historical records show a range of decolonization experiences, some relatively negotiated, others violent, with detention, counterinsurgency, and heavy surveillance. The revelation is that imperial governments frequently framed resistance as criminality, just as they had in earlier centuries. and used emergency powers to maintain control as long as possible. The gift narrative flatters the empire even as it ends. It makes power look like wisdom rather than pressure. It also reduces the agency of colonized peoples, turning them into passive recipients of freedom rather than authors of their own liberation. And speaking of authorship, Britain's national story often claims it has a special relationship with freedom of speech. The next lie is about what that actually looked like when speech threatened power. Lie 44. Britain always had a strong tradition of free speech. The setup is a proud belief that Britain's public life has always allowed debate and dissent. The pivot is that the boundaries of acceptable speech have shifted according to who was speaking and what they threatened. Radical printers, labour organisers, Irish nationalists, colonial critics and anti-war voices have all faced periods of censorship, prosecution and surveillance. Libel laws, sedition charges and informal pressure could silence inconvenient arguments. The revelation is that free speech has often been celebrated as an abstract principle while being constrained in practice during moments of fear. Historical records show the state's repeated anxiety. Pamphlets, newspapers, meetings, and later broadcasts. Power rarely objects to speech that flatters it. The tests come when speech organizes people. The lie is the timelessness. Freedom of speech in Britain has been an arena, won and narrowed and won again, not a permanent inheritance. And speaking of arenas, let's talk about Parliament itself, the institution British history tends to portray as a rational choir of public servants. Lie 45. Parliamentary politics was mainly about principle, not patronage. The setup is noble debate, speeches, reforms and wise leaders. The pivot is that for long stretches British parliamentary politics was soaked in patronage, jobs, favours, bought votes, controlled boroughs and family networks that treated seats as property. Reform Acts in the 19th century changed the electorate in stages, but the revelation is that each reform was contested because it threatened existing power. Representation could mean representing landowners' interests. Liberty could mean liberty for property to operate without restriction. This is documented in election scandals, rotten borough descriptions, and the constant attention paid to who controlled what seat. The modern image of parliamentary legitimacy was built over time, and sometimes built as a response to the fear of revolution. The lie is that the system always worked as advertised. It often worked as intended, just not in the way the posters suggest. And speaking of posters, the next lie is that Britain's national identity has always been cohesive, when in fact it has often been assembled from tension. Lie 46. Britishness has always been a natural, uncontested identity. The setup is an ancient unity, a shared character, shared values, shared story. The pivot is that Britain is a union of nations with distinct histories, languages, and political grievances, stitched together through conquest, negotiation, economic pressure, and sometimes brute force. Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were not simply provinces waiting to become British. The revelation is that Britishness has often been strongest as a political project when it served strategic needs, war, empire, trade, and weaker when those needs faded, or when local identities demanded recognition. This is documented in rebellions, cultural revivals, debates over governance, and the periodic resurfacing of national questions. The lie is that unity is the default. Often it is the result of deliberate maintenance. And speaking of maintenance, one of the most maintained myths is that the monarchy is above politics. Lie 47. The monarchy has been above politics since modern times. The setup is ceremonial royalty, ribbon cutting, neutral smiles, tradition without power. The pivot is that monarchy's political role has changed, but it has never been purely decorative. Influence can be indirect, through access, symbolism, patronage, and behind-the-scenes briefing. Historically, monarchs actively shaped politics for centuries, even after formal powers narrowed. The revelation is that the crown remained a central part of legitimacy. Governments used monarchy to stabilize authority. The monarchy used governments to preserve itself. and the institution's wealth, land, and constitutional position created a kind of political gravity. Neutrality is partly performance, sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic because appearing non-partisan is itself a political advantage. The lie is that monarchy is outside the game. It is a piece on the board that learned to look like the board itself. And speaking of games, the next lie is about sport, specifically the story that Britain invented fair play and exported it. Lie 48. Britain exported sport as purely benevolent culture. The setup is cricket whites and gentlemanly rules, sport as a friendly gift to the world. The pivot is that sport also travelled with empire as a tool of cultural influence, shaping identities, teaching discipline, and promoting certain values aligned with imperial order. Yes, colonized peoples embraced and transformed these sports in powerful ways. That's part of the beauty. But the revelation is that the initial export was not neutral. It was tied to schools, military culture, and the idea of molding character in ways useful to rulers. Historical accounts show sport used to build solidarity among settlers and to separate them from local populations. It could be a way of asserting superiority while claiming politeness. The lie is that it was just a game. Often it was a language of power. And speaking of polite power, the next lie insists Britain's class system is mostly about tradition, not about material extraction. Lie 49. Class in Britain is just culture and accent, not structure. The setup is comedy, posh voices, working class banter, a national joke that class is quirky rather than consequential. The pivot is that class has been an engine, shaping education, housing, health, life expectancy, and political influence. Accent can signal class, yes, but the revelation is what accent often hides. Inherited wealth, land ownership, access to elite networks, and a legal and economic history that concentrated resources. Class is not just a feeling, it is an architecture. Historical records show policy choices that protected property and constrained labor. They show institutions that reproduced privilege. Even when opportunities expanded, the distribution of risk and security remained unequal. The lie is that class is harmless. It has always been a system with winners, and it tends to defend its own rules. And speaking of rules, the next lie says Britain's economic success came from hard work alone, not from financial innovation that sometimes looked suspiciously like legalized predation. Lie 50. Britain's wealth was built mainly on industry, not finance and empire. The setup is factories and inventors. The pivot is that finance, banks, insurance, stock markets, credit was central, and it fed off imperial extraction as well as domestic industry. London became a financial hub, and the revelation is that financial power can outlast industrial power. You can manufacture goods, but you can also control shipping, ensure trade, lend to governments, and profit from interest and speculation. Historical records show the deep interconnection. Wars funded through borrowing, empire facilitated through investment, plantations insured in metropolitan markets, and global trade flows routed through British institutions. The lie isn't that industry mattered. It's that the story is told as if wealth came cleanly from invention without acknowledging the systems that multiplied and sometimes laundered the profits. And speaking of laundering, the next lie is that Britain's museums are just neutral treasure houses of world culture. Lie 51. British museums are purely educational, not political trophy rooms. The setup is marble halls and hushed voices, a story that museums are just libraries for objects, neutral, enlightened, above the mess of how things got there. The pivot is that collections are often the afterglow of power. Many famous holdings entered Britain through conquest, unequal treaties, colonial administrators with packing crates, or purchases made in conditions where refusal wasn't really an option. Historical records show intense 19th century competition between European powers to acquire antiquities. The revelation is that universal museum language can function like a moral umbrella. If everything belongs to everyone, then nobody has to answer the awkward question of who took what, when, and under what authority. This doesn't mean every curator is a villain twirling a moustache behind the pottery. It means the institution is built on histories of extraction that are easier to admire than to audit. And the debate isn't just about objects, it's about recognition of whose past is being displayed and whose loss is being treated as the entrance fee for someone else's education. And speaking of entrance fees, Britain has long been good at turning other people's costs into its own cultural capital. Lie 52. The British Empire was mainly about trade, not violence. The setup is shopkeeper imperialism, merchants' treaties and gentle commerce spreading around the world like tea in hot water. The pivot is that trade and violence weren't separate lanes. Violence was often the enforcement mechanism when trade didn't go Britain's way. Warships, forts, punitive expeditions, and coerced agreements appear repeatedly in official correspondence. The revelation is that opening markets can be a euphemism for forcing access, protecting monopolies, and punishing resistance. Even when violence wasn't constant, its possibility sat in the background like a loaded argument. And violence didn't have to be a battlefield to be effective. It could be legal violence, land seizures and forced labor regimes. It could be economic violence, tax systems that extracted cash from subsistence communities. It could be administrative violence, detention without trial, collective punishment, mass displacement. Trade was real, profit was real, but the clean trade-only myth exists so the empire can be remembered as clever instead of coercive. Meanwhile, another clean myth says Britain's industrial success was powered by genius alone, not by bodies. Lie 53. The Industrial Revolution was driven mainly by inventors, not by exploitation. The setup is heroic. A handful of brilliant minds, a few patents, and a nation lifting itself by ingenuity. The pivot is that innovation mattered, but the system that made it profitable often depended on cheap labor, long hours, weak protections, and the ability to discipline workers into reliable machine parts. Contemporary investigations describe the reality of early factories and mines, danger, fatigue, and a workforce that included children, because small bodies fit where adult bodies didn't. The revelation is that efficiency is often a moral word used to describe who gets pushed harder for someone else's output, and the profits didn't simply rain down. They concentrated, they bought influence, they shaped law, they financed empire. That doesn't make every inventor sinister. It makes the invention story incomplete when it forgets that a steam engine doesn't spin without humans feeding it fuel, tending it, and paying for it with their lungs. And speaking of lungs, the next lie is that Britain's public health improvements arrived naturally, not because people fought for them. Lie 54. Sanitation and health reform happened because elites cared. The setup is the Victorian reformer, kindly and rational, building sewers out of compassion. The pivot is that reform was often driven by fear. Fear of cholera, fear of unrest, fear that disease in poor districts would spread into rich ones. Official reports on urban conditions didn't simply inspire pity, they inspired panic. The revelation is that public health investment frequently followed outbreaks, scandals, and social pressure rather than leading them. When elites acted, they often did so when inaction became expensive, economically, politically, or personally, and reforms were not purely benevolent in design. Some were tied to surveillance, inspecting homes, regulating behavior, policing nuisance. Hygiene could become a new language of control, where the poor were blamed for conditions created by overcrowding and low wages. Improvement happened. Lives were saved. But the lie is that it was a gentle moral awakening rather than a contested process fueled by crisis and pressure. And speaking of pressure, British schools love a myth about stiff upper lips that quietly excuses suffering. Lie 55. The stiff upper lip is an ancient national trait. The setup is timeless character. Britons have always been emotionally restrained, calmly enduring hardship. The pivot is that cultures change, and this particular ideal was sharpened by class and empire, promoted in elite schools, military traditions, and public narratives that framed emotional expression as weakness. The revelation is that stiff upper lip can be less a natural trait and more a social command. Don't complain, don't disrupt, don't embarrass the institution. It is very useful if you're the institution. It's less useful if you're the person being hurt by it. Historical accounts show plenty of emotional expression in the past: public grief, riot, religious enthusiasm, sentimental literature. Restraint became a badge in certain circles, and those circles had disproportionate power to define national behavior. The myth survives because it feels flattering. It also functions as a quiet gag. If suffering is honorable, then demanding change becomes shameful. And speaking of shame, the next lie says the poor were poor because they deserved it. Lie 56. Victorians believed poverty was moral failure because poverty really was moral failure. The setup is smug certainty. Hard-working people succeed, lazy people don't, and the system is therefore fair. The pivot is that Victorian Britain experienced massive economic upheaval. Enclosure, industrial cycles, migration, illness, injury, old age, widowhood, any of which could drop a family into desperate need. Charity casebooks, official inquiries, and contemporary journalism describe how quickly misfortune could cascade. The revelation is that moral explanations were convenient. If poverty is personal, the structure is innocent. If hunger is deserved, the wealthy can sleep. Victorians were not one mind. Many fought these ideas, built mutual aid networks, and demanded reform. But the dominant moral language often framed poverty as suspect. That suspicion shaped policy: deterrent relief, intrusive inspections, public humiliation. The lie isn't that some individuals made bad choices. It's that the system taught itself to call structural harm character. And speaking of character, the next lie insists Britain's elite education system is an ancient meritocracy. Lie 57. Elite schools have always been about merit, not networks. The setup is scholarship boys climbing ladders through talent, proving the system is fair. The pivot is that elite education has long been a pipeline, producing shared accents, shared assumptions, and shared contacts that turn opportunity into inheritance. Historical records show the growth of public schools and universities as makers of ruling culture. The revelation is that the value wasn't only the curriculum, it was the social sorting. It was learning how to belong. It was meeting the people who would later hire you, promote you, marry you, or believe you. Merit exists. But when merit is assessed by people who already share your manners and references, it starts to look suspiciously like self-recognition. And when the costs are high, the gatekeeping is built in before the exams begin. If you want to understand British power, follow the networks, not just the speeches. And speaking of speeches, the next lie says Britain's wars were fought for the people, not for the empire. Lie 58. Britain's wars were primarily defensive and morally clean. The setup is national survival. Britain only fights when forced, reluctantly, and always for freedom. The pivot is that Britain fought many wars for strategic advantage. Trade routes, colonies, prestige, balance of power, and the protection of investments. Contemporary justifications often emphasize defense because we're here to protect ourselves is easier to sell than we're here to secure resources. The revelation is how frequently moral language followed military action, like a press release, smoothing rough edges after decisions were already made. Even in wars with genuine defensive elements, the conduct could be harsh. Naval blockades starved economies. Campaigns abroad involved scorched earth tactics and collective punishment, and the costs fell unevenly. Working men fought, elites often directed, and colonized peoples paid in ways rarely centered in British memory. The lie isn't that Britain was always aggressive. It's that the national story tends to present strategy as virtue. And speaking of virtue, the next lie is that Britain invented modern humanitarianism while keeping its hands clean. Lie 59. Britain was always a global humanitarian leader. The setup is comforting. A nation that cares, sending aid, championing rights. The pivot is that humanitarian action has existed alongside exploitation, and sometimes as a cover for it. There were genuine reformers, missionaries, and activists who fought against suffering, but the revelation is that humanitarian language could be used to justify intervention, to claim moral authority, or to soften the image of empire. Helping can be real and still be politically useful. Official statements often framed Britain as a moral adult in a world of unruly children, an attitude that conveniently supported control. And when humanitarian concern conflicted with economic interest, the results were frequently compromised. This isn't a rejection of compassion. It's a refusal to let compassion become an alibi. And speaking of alibis, one of the most persistent is the idea that colonial borders were drawn carefully and responsibly. Lie 60. Britain drew colonial borders with care and local consent. The setup is administrative competence. Maps drawn by serious men in serious rooms creating stable states. The pivot is that borders were often drawn to serve imperial convenience, strategic buffers, resource access, and simplified administration, frequently with minimal local input and little concern for existing communities, rivalries, or identities. The revelation is that arbitrary lines can become long-term fault lines. When boundaries cut through ethnic groups, trade routes, grazing lands, or religious regions, they can harden tensions that were once flexible. And when imperial administrators favored certain groups for governance or military recruitment, they altered local power balances in ways that outlasted empire. Historical records show a constant imperial emphasis on manageability. The map was often designed for the ruler's ease, not the ruled's stability. The resulting conflicts aren't ancient tribal hatreds. Sometimes they're modern legacies of administrative shortcuts. And speaking of shortcuts, British history education often takes a shortcut by pretending Scotland joined the Union because it simply wanted to. Lie 61. Scotland joined the Union purely out of friendship and logic. The setup is rational union, shared island, shared interests, shared prosperity. The pivot is that the 1707 Union followed intense economic pressure, political bargaining and fear on both sides about war, succession, and stability. Scotland had its own political debates and divisions, and the Darien scheme's disastrous failure is often discussed as part of the economic context. The revelation is that union was not an uncomplicated celebration. It produced resistance, resentment, and a long cultural argument about autonomy that never fully disappeared. And union didn't dissolve inequality. Power concentrated in ways that benefited certain elites. Others felt absorbed rather than partnered. This is documented in contemporary pamphlets and later unrest, including Jacobite support, that drew on complex loyalties, not just romantic nostalgia. The lie is that union is simply the obvious endpoint of geography. In reality, it is an ongoing negotiation, sometimes polite, sometimes not. And speaking of Jacobites, the next lie is that the Jacobite rebellions were only a Highland tantrum. Lie 62. Jacobitism was just Highland romance and Catholic plottery. The setup is Tartan rebellion, wild Highlanders charging for a lost cause. The pivot is that Jacobitism was a serious political movement with support across regions and classes, bound up with questions of legitimacy, religion and resentment toward the post-1688 settlement. There were Catholics involved, yes. There were also Protestants. There were Highland clans, yes. There were also Lowland supporters and English Jacobites. The revelation is that the rebellions of 1715 and 1745 were not only cultural episodes, they were political crises that frightened the state, and the aftermath was not merely a defeat. It involved systematic attempts to dismantle the military and social structures of the Highlands, reshape landholding and enforce central authority. Romantic Tartan mythology came later, ironically popularized in ways that softened the violence of suppression into costume. The lie is that it was just a colorful footnote. It was a struggle over the shape of the state. And speaking of the shape of the state, the next lie claims Britain's parliamentary stability meant Britain avoided the kind of revolutionary repression seen elsewhere. Lie 63. Britain never feared revolution enough to panic. The setup is smug exceptionalism. France had terror. Britain had tea. The pivot is that Britain's ruling class feared revolution intensely, especially after 1789, and that fear shaped policy, policing and propaganda for decades. Contemporary records show crackdowns on radical societies, aggressive prosecution for sedition, and the use of informants. The revelation is that Britain's stability was sometimes achieved through preemptive force, containing mass politics before it could build a revolutionary momentum. This doesn't mean Britain was identical to revolutionary France. It means Britain wasn't serenely immune. It was anxious and strategic. It managed the temperature of reform, tightening when pressure rose, loosening when it risked explosion. The lie survives because we never panicked sounds like maturity. The reality is a state that panicked often, but preferred to do it with paperwork. And speaking of paperwork, the next lie says the census and statistics were neutral tools, not instruments of control. Lie 64. Britain's modern bureaucracy was purely benign. The setup is efficiency, forms, records, systems that help society function. The pivot is that record-keeping can also be a way of seeing people as categories to be managed rather than humans to be served. Tax records, poor law documents, policing reports, colonial censuses, official records show a growing administrative appetite to measure, classify and regulate. The revelation is that classification often reflects power. Who counts as respectable, employable, criminal, sane, vagrant, native, mixed, illegitimate? These labels can determine rights and treatment. Bureaucracy can build hospitals and schools. It can also build detention systems and surveillance networks. The lie is neutrality. Administration always embodies values, and in Britain's case, those values often served property, order, and imperial hierarchy. And speaking of hierarchy, the next lie is that Britain's aristocracy faded into harmlessness long ago. Lie 65. The aristocracy became symbolic and irrelevant after industrialization. The setup is fading dukes, declining estates, modern businessmen replacing old lords. The pivot is that while industrial wealth rose, aristocratic power proved adaptable. Land remained valuable. Titles remained socially magnetic. Political influence persisted through the House of Lords, local authority, and marriage into new money. The revelation is that elites often fused rather than vanished. Industrialists bought estates. Aristocrats invested in industry. The ruling class evolved like a species, absorbing threats by incorporating them. Official records and social histories show aristocratic dominance in many local institutions well into the modern era. Even when legal privilege narrowed, cultural privilege, networks, education, access continued to amplify influence. The lie is that the old elite simply died out. It mostly learned new tricks. And speaking of tricks, Britain's national story loves a trick called inventing tradition. Lie 66. British traditions are mostly ancient and unchanged. The setup is timeless ceremony, rituals handed down unchanged from misty antiquity. The pivot is that many ancient traditions were reshaped, standardized, or even created in relatively modern periods, especially the 19th century, when Britain was anxious about change and hungry for symbols of continuity. This is documented in the way ceremonies were formalized, costumes standardized, and narratives polished. The revelation is that tradition can be an emotional technology. It reassures people that the system is stable, that hierarchy is natural, that today's power is rooted in sacred yesterday. That doesn't make tradition fake in the sense of meaningless. It makes it curated, like a museum exhibit of identity. As some practices are old, many are edited, and the edits often serve the same purpose: legitimacy. And speaking of legitimacy, the next lie says the British monarchy's wealth is mainly private and self-funded. Lie 67. The monarchy pays for itself in a simple, clear way. The setup is a tidy claim. The monarchy brings in tourism, so it's a net profit. Case closed. The pivot is that the financial relationship between crown, state, land, and public funding is complex and often misunderstood, even by people arguing about it. Royal finances involve historical arrangements, property revenues, and public funding mechanism. The revelation is that pays for itself is usually a slogan rather than an audited statement. Tourism is influenced by many factors, and the existence of palaces doesn't mean ticket sales equal the full costs and benefits across the economy. This isn't an argument for or against monarchy. It's an argument against arithmetic as propaganda. When institutions are wrapped in heritage, the accounting becomes emotional, and emotional accounting is a great way to avoid answering concrete questions. And speaking of concrete questions, the next lie claims Britain's wars were won by plucky underdogs, not by logistics and industrial capacity. Lie 68. Britain wins wars through character more than supply. The setup is the little island with big courage. The pivot is that courage matters, but wars are often won by shipping tonnage, fuel, factories, intelligence, alliances, and the capacity to replace losses. Historical records show the centrality of finance and global supply chains, especially in the 20th century. The revelation is that national character stories can become a way of erasing material realities, including the contribution of allies and the exploitation of colonial resources. And the plucky myth can also turn suffering into a virtue badge, discouraging scrutiny of leadership failures. If victory is character, then mistakes become unpatriotic to discuss, but the past is full of blunders, strategic misjudgments, preventable disasters, underestimation of enemies that were survived because of deeper systems and broader coalitions. Character is part of war. Logistics is the spine. The lie is pretending the spine doesn't exist. And speaking of spines, the next lie says Britain's economy has always been stable because Britain is pragmatic. Lie 69. Britain is naturally pragmatic and so avoids extreme. The setup is national temperament, sensible compromises, moderate politics, steady institutions. The pivot is that Britain has experienced extreme inequality, brutal labour conditions, violent repression and ideological fervour, often packaged as moderation because it wore a suit. The revelation is that pragmatism can be a branding strategy. It frames the status quo as reasonable and alternatives as reckless. Yet many major changes in Britain were once condemned as dangerous radicalism. Union rights, voting rights, welfare systems, labour protections. Historical debates show intense ideological conflict beneath the surface. Britain's politics often moved through crisis management, resist change until pressure becomes unbearable, then reform just enough to restore stability. That's not natural moderation, that's tactical adaptation. And speaking of adaptation, the next lie is that British identity has always been neatly white, Christian, and unchanging. Lie 70. Immigration is a modern thing that changed a previously pure Britain. The setup is nostalgia, a homogeneous past disrupted by recent arrivals. The pivot is that Britain has always been connected to movement. Romans, Normans, merchants, refugees, sailors, soldiers, students, workers. Cities like London were cosmopolitan in different ways across different centuries. Historical records and community histories show Jewish communities, Huguenot refugees, black sailors and residents, Irish migration and countless other threads woven into the national fabric long before the modern era. The revelation is that what changes is not whether people move, but how states label them, police them, and tell stories about them. The pure past myth is useful for politics because it turns diversity into an intrusion rather than a continuity. It also turns inequality into cultural incompatibility rather than policy. Britain didn't become diverse. Britain has been diverse, often while pretending it wasn't. Lie 71. Britain always welcomed refugees because it loves liberty. The setup is a self-portrait. Britain as a safe haven, doors open, tyranny kept politely outside by strong tea and stronger principles. The pivot is that Britain has sometimes welcomed refugees, often proudly, but it has also frequently restricted, delayed and rationed compassion, especially when the refugees were poor, politically inconvenient, or easy to scapegoat. Historical records show waves of arrivals, religious refugees like Huguenots, Jewish refugees fleeing persecution, displaced people after wars. The revelation is that welcome was rarely unconditional. It came with suspicion, surveillance, and arguments about burden and undesirables. Public sympathy could turn quickly into hostility when jobs, housing, or fear became part of the story. And welcome often depended on usefulness. Skilled workers could be praised as a boost to industry. Others were framed as a social threat. The state's attitude shifted with domestic politics, not just moral clarity. The lie isn't that Britain never provided sanctuary. The lie is the flattering permanence of it, as if generosity is a national constant rather than a contested choice made, revoked, and renegotiated again and again. And speaking of contested choices, the next lie is about who exactly won the Second World War and whose victory story gets told. Lie 72. World War II was won mainly by British grit, not by global sacrifice. The setup is stirring. The island holds, the RAF rises, the people endure, and victory follows as a moral reward. The pivot is that Britain's endurance mattered. But the war was won through a vast coalition and an industrial and human scale of sacrifice that extended far beyond Britain's shores. Contemporary military records and post-war analysis show the staggering weight of the Eastern Front, the industrial output of the United States, and the contributions of Commonwealth and colonial troops. The revelation is that British victory is often narrated in a way that shrinks everyone else into supporting caste, useful for national pride, less useful for truth. Even within Britain, the war effort wasn't evenly shared. The Blitz hit some districts harder than others. Rationing was universal, but comfort wasn't. And the experience of service varied by class, role, and geography. The grit is real. The solo myth is the lie, because it turns a global catastrophe into a national character advert. And speaking of adverts, few are as polished as the next one. Lie 73. The Blitz created perfect national unity. The setup is warm. Londoners singing in shelters, class barriers melting under bombs, a nation becoming one family. The pivot is that shared danger can create solidarity, but it can also expose inequality in bright flaming detail. Contemporary accounts describe overcrowded shelters, uneven access to safety, and resentment when wealthy areas seemed better protected or better informed. The revelation is that Blitz spirit became a story the nation told itself partly to keep going and partly to keep questions quiet. People were brave, people helped each other, and people also argued, stole, panicked, profiteered, and complained because they were human beings, not propaganda posters. Unity existed in moments. It did not erase class. The lie is not the courage. The lie is the comforting idea that crisis automatically produces fairness, rather than revealing who already had advantages when the sirens started. And speaking of comforting stories, the next one turns an emergency evacuation into a miracle scrubbed of its sharper edges. Lie 74. Dunkirk was a pure triumph. Not a strategic disaster survived. The setup is romantic. Little boats, heroism on the sea, a nation rescuing its sons with stubborn courage. The pivot is that Dunkirk in 1940 was an evacuation from a collapsing situation, an escape that succeeded against the odds, not a victory in the usual sense. Military records show huge losses of equipment and the strategic danger Britain faced afterward. The revelation is that focusing only on the miracle can turn hard questions about planning, command decisions, and broader campaign failures into background noise. The small boat story is also selective. Naval vessels did much of the heavy lifting, and many who contributed were not the stereotypical gentleman sailor of later nostalgia. The event became a symbol because Britain needed one. Symbols can be useful. They can also become a way of hiding how close a system came to breaking and who paid for the improvisation. And speaking of who paid, the next lie is that Britain emerged from the war ready to reward everyone equally. Lie 75. Post-war Britain built a fair society and then kept it. The setup is hopeful. The welfare state rises, the NHS is born, housing is built, and Britain learns the lesson of shared sacrifice. The pivot is that post-war reforms were enormous and also imperfect, uneven, and constantly contested. Official debates and social histories show a nation balancing ambition against austerity, rationing against reconstruction, and ideals against entrenched class power. The revelation is that the fair society was never a stable, finished product. It was a political battleground. Even at the height of post-war consensus, inequalities persisted. In housing quality, education access, employment opportunities, and whose voices shaped policy. Reforms improved lives dramatically, but they didn't flatten the country into equality, and later decades saw political movements that worked to roll back or reshape that settlement. The lie is the fairy tale arc. We fixed it, and then lost it. The reality is we built something, argued over it, and never stopped arguing. And speaking of the NHS, the next lie is one of the most beloved. Lie 76. The NHS was created purely from kindness and national unity. The setup is angelic. A grateful nation builds healthcare for all because it suddenly becomes morally enlightened. The pivot is that the NHS, founded in 1948, was created through political struggle, negotiation, and fierce resistance from powerful interests, because universal healthcare changes who controls money and authority. Contemporary records show intense debate, especially around doctors' contracts and the role of private practice. The revelation is that the NHS wasn't simply given, it was built by a government willing to fight for a model, shaped by wartime planning, and pushed by public expectation that sacrifice should produce security. It was also born into scarcity. Hospitals differed in quality, services expanded over time, and from the start, it became a symbol, a moral centerpiece of British identity. That symbolism can obscure the machinery, budgets, staffing, regional inequality, and political choices that determine what universal actually means in practice. The NHS is real. The fairy tale version, effortless, unanimous, apolitical, is the lie. And speaking of unanimity, the next lie is that Britain became post-racial the moment the empire ended. Lie 77. Racism is mainly an American problem that Britain didn't really have. The setup is denial with manners. Britain is polite, therefore it can't be racist in a structural way. The pivot is that Britain's racial hierarchies were shaped by empire, migration, and domestic policy, and they show up in housing, employment, policing, and social treatment, often behind a thin veil of civility. Historical records and community histories describe discrimination in renting, hiring, and access to services. The revelation is that polite racism can be harder to name precisely because it hides inside common sense, standards, and fit. It doesn't always shout. It excludes. The empire also mattered here. A society that governed millions through racial assumptions didn't magically shed those assumptions when colonial flags came down. They returned home in jokes, laws, fears, and institutional habits. The lie is that Britain's problems are always smaller because they're quieter. Quiet can be a feature, not a virtue. And speaking of quiet habits, the next lie is about the Windrush generation and the way a welcome story can turn into a trap. Lie 78. Windrush migration was simple. Britain invited, people arrived. Everyone benefited. The setup is a tidy narrative. Post-war labour shortage, Commonwealth citizens come to rebuild, and Britain becomes richer and more diverse. The end. The pivot is that while many were invited, explicitly or implicitly, their lives were shaped by discrimination, hostility, and shifting legal definitions of belonging. Contemporary accounts describe signs in windows, barriers to work and housing, and social suspicion. The revelation is that later policy changes could reframe long-term residence as suddenly irregular, as if decades of living, working, paying taxes, and raising families could be overwritten by paperwork. Belonging became conditional, on documents people were never told to keep, on administrative systems that could lose records, on political rhetoric that turned immigrants into a convenient target. The human consequence wasn't abstract, it was anxiety, exclusion, and in some cases removal from the life someone had built. The lie is that migration is a closed chapter with a happy moral. It is an ongoing relationship between people and the state can change its tone. And speaking of changing tone, the next lie is that the troubles in Northern Ireland were just ancient hatred, nothing to do with policy. Lie 79. The troubles were inevitable, sectarian violence with no political cause. The setup is resignation. Catholics and Protestants just hate each other, and violence is therefore timeless and unfixable. The pivot is that the troubles were rooted in political structures, partition, governance, discrimination, policing, and competing national identities, shaped by modern decisions, not medieval destiny. Historical records show civil rights campaigns, state responses, community fear, and escalating cycles of violence involving paramilitaries and security forces. The revelation is that framing it as sectarian alone can erase questions of power. Who held authority? Who had access to housing and jobs? How electoral boundaries were drawn? How policing was perceived and experienced? None of this excuses murder. It explains why the conflict became combustible, and it also explains why resolution required political frameworks, not just calls for people to be nicer. The lie is inevitability. The reality is a human-made system, and human-made systems can be changed, though not without cost. And speaking of cost, the next lie is that Britain's 20th century economic transformations were simply natural weather systems. Lie 80. Deindustrialization was inevitable, so no one is responsible. The setup is fatalism. Industries decline, markets change, nothing can be done. The country modernizes. The pivot is that economic change includes choices about investment, regional support, labor relations, housing, training, and what kind of society a government is willing to build. Historical records show communities dependent on mines, mills, shipyards, and steelworks, industries that provided identity as well as wages. The revelation is that when these industries collapsed or were closed, the damage wasn't only economic, it was social. Unemployment, ill health, addiction, fractured family life, and a loss of local purpose. Some change would have happened regardless, but the speed, the support, and the distribution of pain are political. And when elites describe suffering as inevitable, it often means acceptable. The lie isn't that economies shift. The lie is that policy is powerless. And speaking of policy, the next lie is that Britain's welfare system removed poverty as a serious problem. Lie 81. The welfare state ended poverty, so poverty afterward is personal failure. The setup is a comforting conclusion. Once benefits exist, anyone still struggling must be irresponsible. The pivot is that welfare systems reduce hardship, but they do not automatically erase poverty, especially when housing costs, wages, disability, childcare, and regional inequality remain unresolved. Official reports and social research across decades describe cycles of deprivation that persist even in wealthy societies. The revelation is that welfare often becomes a battleground over deservingness rather than a tool for stability. Rules tighten, stigma grows, claimants are watched and judged, and the political temptation is constant. Blame the poor for being poor, because it is cheaper than fixing the causes. The welfare state can be a lifeline. It can also be designed as a maze. The lie is pretending that once the lifeline exists, anyone drowning is choosing to. And speaking of mazes, the next lie is that Britain never built camps, because that's something other countries do. Lie 82. Britain never used concentration camps or mass detention. The setup is moral distance. Britain fights camps. Britain doesn't run them. The pivot is that Britain has used mass detention in different forms and different contexts, including during imperial wars, sometimes under euphemisms that soften what is being done. Historical records from the South African War at the turn of the 20th century describe the establishment of camps for civilians, with catastrophic conditions and death rates. The revelation is not a cheap comparison game. It is a reminder that the machinery of gather them, hold them, control them exists in many states when they feel threatened or when they want to break resistance. In later colonial conflicts, emergency regulations and detention without trial appeared again. The details vary by place and period, and historians debate specifics, but the pattern is documented. Mass confinement as a method of control. The lie survives because it protects national self-image, but self-image is not evidence. And speaking of evidence, the next lie is that Britain's empire ended cleanly with no messy secrets left in filing cabinets. Lie 83. Britain left its colonies with orderly records and nothing to hide. The setup is administrative pride. Britain loves paperwork, therefore the imperial archive must be complete and honest. The pivot is that empires manage their reputations and records can be removed, destroyed, or withheld, especially when they document abuses that would look ugly under later scrutiny. Historians have long noted gaps and absences in colonial documentation. The revelation is that absence is itself a clue. If a system was confident in its virtue, it wouldn't need to tidy up its paper trail. This doesn't mean every missing file is a smoking gun. It means states curate memory. They decide what becomes history by deciding what survives. And when colonial violence is at stake, that curation can protect careers, institutions, and national myths. The lie is that archives are neutral vaults. Often they are battlegrounds over what the future is allowed to know. And speaking of what the future is allowed to know, the next lie is that British education has always taught empire honestly. Lie 84. British schools have always taught empire objectively. The setup is sincerity. Teachers tell the truth, textbooks are factual, and national history is simply what happened. The pivot is that curricula are political decisions. What gets included, what gets minimized, and what gets framed as complicated rather than wrong shapes how a society understands itself. For a long time, empire was taught as exploration, trade, and governance, with violence treated as unfortunate exception. The revelation is that this wasn't ignorance. It was convenient, an honest account of empire forces' uncomfortable questions about wealth, identity, and moral inheritance. Historical debates over education show recurring tension. Do you teach pride, or do you teach complexity? Many systems choose pride first, then call complexity controversial. But controversy is often just the noise of denied facts finally being spoken aloud. The lie is neutrality. Education is always a map, and maps always have borders drawn by someone. And speaking of borders, one of the most world-altering British decisions is often taught like a neat administrative solution. Lie 85. Partition was a clean technical fix that simply had to happen. The setup is inevitability. Communities can't coexist, so borders must be drawn, and the state politely withdraws. The pivot is that partition decisions, wherever they occur, are not purely technical. They are political acts with human consequences, often carried out under pressure, time limits, and competing interests. Historical records and contemporary accounts describe the chaos that can follow hurried boundary making, displacement, violence, and trauma that reshapes generations. The revelation is that imperial withdrawal is rarely neutral. It can accelerate conflict by freezing identities into hard categories and leaving behind institutions too weak or too biased to manage the shock. If details are debated, say so plainly. Historians argue about motives, alternatives, and degrees of responsibility, but what is well supported is that rushed administrative decisions made under political strain can produce catastrophes that later get blamed on ancient hatred, conveniently absolving the administrators. The lie is clean exit. Empires rarely leave without splinters. Lie 86. Britain's modern democracy arrived without violent struggle. The setup is a soothing national self-image. Britain reformed peacefully, with polite debates and gradual improvement. The pivot is that while Britain avoided some revolutionary ruptures, political change still involved violence, coercion, and the constant threat of force, often aimed at ordinary people demanding representation, wages, or basic dignity. There were riots, crackdowns, arrests, and moments when troops faced crowds. There were hunger protests and strike confrontations. The revelation is that peaceful progress is sometimes a retrospective gloss applied after the danger has passed. When movements were active, elites often described them as mobs, criminals, or foreign-inspired threats. That framing justified repression. Democracy was not just expanded, it was defended by those who feared it in the name of stability, and reforms were frequently calibrated to prevent worse upheaval. Britain's political evolution looks calm in hindsight, partly because it was continually managed, controlled, and negotiated under pressure. The lie is serenity, the truth is friction. And speaking of friction, the next lie is that Britain's press has always been a fearless watchdog, unbought and unafraid. Lie 87. The British press has always held power to account. The setup is romantic journalism, bold papers speaking truth to power, exposing injustice for the public good. The pivot is that the press has sometimes done that, and also sometimes served power, amplified prejudice, protected elites, and turned complex issues into moral panics that sell. Historical examples show newspapers campaigning for reforms and also campaigning against migrants, unions, and undesirables. The revelation is that media is an industry. It responds to owners, advertisers, political alliances, and the hunger for attention. Those forces shape what becomes newsworthy and what becomes a footnote. And the state has long understood the press as a tool. During wars and crises, censorship and propaganda shape narratives. In peacetime, informal access and insider relationships can blur the line between scrutiny and cooperation. The lie is that the press is naturally virtuous. Like any institution, it can be brave or complicit, depending on incentives, and the incentives aren't always noble. And speaking of incentives, the next lie claims Britain's global relationships were shaped mainly by ideals, not by raw economic interest. Lie 88. Britain's foreign policy is primarily moral and principled. The setup is dignified diplomacy. Britain stands for rules, democracy, and the common good. The pivot is that foreign policy is often driven by strategic interest, security, trade, influence, and moral language can follow like a decorative ribbon. Historical records show alliances shifting with necessity. Former enemies become partners. Principles become flexible when resources or geopolitical balance is at stake. The revelation is that states are not saints. They are machines designed to preserve advantage, even while leaders talk about values. This doesn't mean morality is irrelevant. It means morality competes with interests, and interests frequently win. And when moral rhetoric is deployed, it can serve domestic audiences as much as international ones, making decisions feel righteous rather than contested. The lie isn't that Britain ever does good. The lie is that good is the primary engine. And speaking of engines, the next lie says the British economy is a story of hard work rewarded, not a history of inequality maintained. Lie 89. Britain is a land of social mobility where talent rises naturally. The setup is hopeful. Anyone can make it with effort, and Britain rewards merit. The pivot is that mobility exists, but it has long been constrained by housing, schooling, health, networks, inherited wealth, and regional inequality. Historical studies of class and opportunity show patterns repeating across generations. The revelation is that meritocracy often functions as a moral comfort for winners. If you believe you earned everything, you don't have to ask what you inherited or what others were denied. Britain has produced remarkable individual stories of ascent, but focusing only on exceptions can hide the structure that makes exceptions necessary. And the structure is stubborn. It reproduces itself through property, education, and access to cultural capital. The lie is inevitability. The best rise, often the best connected rise. And speaking of connection, the next lie is that Britain's national identity is built mainly on shared memory, not on selective forgetting. Lie 90. Britain remembers its past honestly because it loves history, The setup is quaint: museums, castles, documentaries, a nation obsessed with its own story. The pivot is that loving history and loving truth are not the same thing. Nations often love history because it can be shaped into comfort, pride, and coherence. The revelation is selective memory. Certain episodes are celebrated as national virtues: wartime resilience, parliamentary tradition, abolition, while other episodes are minimized, reframed, or pushed into silence: colonial violence, class brutality, famine policy, coercive labor systems. This is not unique to Britain, but Britain's long continuity makes the selective memory particularly potent. If the story is "we always muddle through," then any evidence of deliberate harm can be dismissed as an aberration, not a pattern. History is not just what happened. It is what gets repeated until it feels like truth. And speaking of repetition, the next lie is one you've heard in 1,000 forms: that the British Empire was a net good. Because look at the railways, the law, the language. Lie 91. The empire did bad things, but overall it was beneficial. The setup is balance sheet morality. A few regrets, but lots of gifts, therefore the conclusion is positive. The pivot is that the overall framing often hides the central ethical question: beneficial for whom and by what right? Infrastructure built for extraction can still be useful later. Yes. Institutions introduced under imperial rule can still shape modern states. Yes. But the revelation is that benefits are frequently counted for the empire and its descendants, while costs are counted as unfortunate side effects for the colonized. And the net good claim often assumes that colonized societies would have remained static without empire, which is a way of denying their agency and alternative futures. Historical records show vibrant economies, political systems, and cultural complexity before British intervention, along with the upheavals caused by it. The lie is the comfort of arithmetic. Human suffering is not a rounding error. And speaking of rounding errors, the next lie is that British military and colonial violence was rare, isolated incidents rather than recurring methods. Lie 92. British violence was exceptional, not systemic. The setup is a few bad events apologized for and regretted, while the overall story remains noble. The pivot is that violence, military, legal, economic, was a consistent tool of empire and domestic control, used in different forms across centuries. Rebellions were met with force, strikes were broken, colonies were pacified. The revelation is that the language of order can normalize brutality. When violence is framed as restoring stability, it becomes easier to repeat. This doesn't mean every British soldier or official was a monster. It means the system created incentives and permissions. It mattered less what individuals felt and more what the institution allowed. And institutions often allowed a great deal when profit, authority, or prestige were threatened. The lie is rarity. The record shows recurrence. And speaking of records, the next lie claims Britain's past is mostly settled, known, so controversy must be political correctness rather than new knowledge. Lie 93. Historian. Keep changing the past for modern agendas. The setup is irritation. Why can't history just stay the same? The pivot is that history changes because evidence changes. New archives open, new methods reveal patterns, and scholars ask better questions. The revelation is that many new criticisms aren't new at all. People at the time criticized the same injustices. Colonized writers protested empire. Workers condemned exploitation. Reformers documented abuse. The difference is whose voices were archived, taught, and believed. Historical understanding evolves. That's not propaganda. That's how inquiry works. And refusing to update the story is itself political, because it preserves comfort for the powerful. The lie is that change equals dishonesty. Sometimes change equals finally listening. And speaking of listening, the next lie is that Britain's cultural heritage is purely national, untouched by the wider world. Lie 94. British culture is self-made, not shaped by global exchange. The setup is island exceptionalism. Britain developed its culture internally, then exported it outward. The pivot is that Britain has always been entangled in global exchange through trade, migration, war, empire, and ideas moving in both directions. Foods, words, fashions, music, and technologies arrived from elsewhere and were absorbed. The revelation is that even what feels traditional often contains global threads, sometimes joyful, sometimes born from exploitation. Tea, sugar, spices, cotton, these were not just tastes, they were imperial systems you could swallow. British culture is real. It's just not pure. It's composite, layered, and shaped by contact, because no culture is an island, even on an island. And speaking of islands, the next lie is about the Second World War again, specifically the idea that Britain fought it as a purely anti-racist crusade. Lie 95. Britain fought Nazism with consistent anti-racist principles. The setup is moral clarity. Britain fights fascism, therefore Britain must have opposed racism in all forms. The pivot is that Britain fought Nazism for survival, alliance commitments, and opposition to a dangerous expansionist regime, and Britain's own society still contained racial hierarchies shaped by empire. Contemporary accounts show colonial troops and workers contributing to the war while facing discrimination. The revelation is that fighting one racist ideology doesn't automatically dismantle the racism embedded in your own institution. People can oppose Hitler and still hold prejudiced views. States can fight a genocidal enemy and still run colonies based on inequality. This doesn't reduce the significance of defeating Nazism. It simply refuses to convert victory into a universal moral certificate. And speaking of certificates, the next lie is that Britain's legal and political institutions are uniquely incorruptible. Lie 96. Britain is largely immune to corruption because its system is old. The setup is trust. Ancient institutions must have learned wisdom by now. The pivot is that old systems can be stable and still produce corruption, sometimes especially because informal networks and unwritten rules can hide accountability. Patronage, lobbying, revolving doors, insider access. These patterns appear repeatedly in modern political history, even when outright bribery is rare. The revelation is that corruption can be legal. It can be the quiet exchange of favors, the shaping of policy by donors, the soft pressure of elite friendship. Britain's system often prides itself on not needing a written constitution to behave. That pride can become a blind spot. If you assume virtue, you stop looking for rot. The lie is immunity. No human system is immune. And speaking of human systems, the next lie is that Britain's story is mostly about kings, queens, and prime ministers, as if everyone else was scenery. Lie 97. Great men shaped Britain. Ordinary people mostly watched. The setup is Crown and Parliament history. Big names, big speeches, and the public as a silent audience. The pivot is that ordinary people shaped Britain constantly, through labour, protest, cultural creation, migration, community survival, and everyday resistance. Historical records of petitions, strikes, boycotts, religious movements, and social change show pressure rising from below. The revelation is that elites often responded to mass action while pretending they led it. When the people win something, institutions frequently rewrite the story so it looks like benevolent leadership rather than forced concession. This isn't romanticizing the people. People can be cruel too. It's recognizing agency. History is not only what rulers did, it is what everyone did, especially those who weren't allowed to leave official memoirs. And speaking of memoirs, the next lie is that Britain's national story is mostly complete, that the big shocks are over. Lie 98. Britain's past is settled, so the future will be peaceful continuity. The setup is comfort. Britain always muddles through, therefore it always will. The pivot is that history doesn't promise stability. It shows cycles of crisis, adaptation, and the constant renegotiation of who gets security and who gets risk. The revelation is that believing the story is settled is how systems repeat themselves. If you assume the worst abuses are behind you, you stop recognizing the early signs. Scapegoating, concentration of wealth, erosion of rights, the normalization of cruelty in polite language. Britain's continuity is real, but continuity can carry injustice forward, as well as carrying institutions. The past is not a museum, it is a toolkit, and people keep using the same tools. And speaking of tools, the final lie is the biggest one because it holds all the others together. Lie 99. British history is a story of steady improvement led by wise elites. The setup is the national bedtime story. Yes, there were mistakes, but overall Britain learned, reformed, civilized itself, and now occupies the moral high ground by natural right. The pivot is that improvement happened, but it was not steady, and it was rarely led by elites without pressure. Progress came in bursts after conflict, after disaster, after people demanded it and refused to be quiet. Rights expanded because people forced the question. Welfare grew because suffering became politically dangerous. Empire retreated because domination became too costly to maintain and too loudly resisted. And even then, gains were never guaranteed. They were defended, diluted, reversed, rebuilt. The revelation is the mechanism. Power almost always narrates itself as wise. That is how it stays legitimate. If rulers admit they were cornered by the public might realize it can corner them again. So history gets edited into gratitude. But when you see the pattern, myth, pressure, concession, rebranding, you start to understand the country more honestly. Not as a saint, not as a villain, as a place where human beings built systems, fought over them, and lived inside the consequences. If you've drifted in and out tonight, that's fine. This kind of history doesn't demand a clenched jaw, it works quietly, like rain soaking into soil, until you look up one day and realize you're less easily hypnotized by tidy stories. Because the 99 lies weren't random, they shared a purpose. They made power look natural. They made cruelty look accidental. They made wealth look earned in isolation. They made conquest sound like curiosity and resistance sound like disorder. And they taught you to admire outcomes without asking who paid for them. But the record keeps whispering through court rolls and parliamentary debates, through letters, petitions, memoirs, and the stubborn memory of communities who refused to vanish. It says, the past was complicated on purpose. People simplified it afterward. So if you remember anything, let it be this. Britain did not glide into modernity on the wings of wise elites. It lurched, argued, exploited, reformed, suppressed, resisted, adapted, and survived, often because ordinary people kept demanding that survival should include dignity. Sleep now. If sleep is what you came for, let the myths fall away gently. And when you wake, notice how often the modern world still tries the same old tricks, just with cleaner fonts, brighter screens, and new slogans on ancient machinery.